This is Shabana Mahmood, the newly appointed Home Secretary, who says she wants to get tougher on illegal migration. What's she going to do? And in fact, has she started doing it already? We will pose and answer those questions on this episode of Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast. Chris, the new cabinet in action today, and already quite a lot of focus on the new Home Secretary.
Yeah, Shabana Mahmood, the new Home Secretary, and with a new ministerial team in the Home Office too. There was something of a clear out, really, of ministers alongside the moving of Yvette Cooper. And there's a subtlety here because, you know, Yvette Cooper got that dealing with illegal immigration was absolutely key and central to the government's political prospects. But the view taken in government is that Shabana Mahmood is unflinching in her instincts, and they think that perhaps she might be able to make quicker progress on the whole issue of small boats and visa overstayers, the whole question of irregular migration. That's their hope, and of course in time we'll work out if there is anything in that. And here we were on the new Home Secretary's effectively first proper full day in the job, certainly as far as a weekday is concerned, and she was centre stage at a get-together of Home Ministers, Interior Ministers, call them what you like, from the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which has been around for almost the best part of a century, which is the UK and the US and Canada and Australia and New Zealand. Now, again, this wasn't a meeting Shabana Mahmood had rustled up in the space of 48 hours. Yvette Cooper would have been there if there hadn't been a reshuffle. But she was very much using it to sort of lean into a sense of the kind of platter of tools that the government is trying to assemble and then talk about to deal with this whole question of illegal immigration. Not just small boats, obviously that's a big part of it and a very visible part of it, but also visa overstayers, so people who arrive legally on a visa but then don't leave when the visa expires. And how do you collectively pull together a range of measures that might do something about that overall challenge?
And one of the tools in the toolkit is this idea of issuing fewer visas to countries if those countries do not cooperate with the UK about returning people from the UK to those countries.
Yeah.
And here is Shabana Mahmood talking about that particular tool.
For us, that means including possibly the cutting of visas in the future, just to say, you know, we do expect countries to play ball, play by the rules, and if one of your citizens has no right to be in our country, you do need to take them back.
Chris, help me out here. I assumed that was a power that the government's already had for a little while.
And that is the argument that the Conservatives make. I think what is interesting about this is the extent to which the government leans into using it. So I was talking to somebody from the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford this afternoon, and I said to them, well, hang on a minute. Are there not a lot of people who will come from particular countries who are deemed to be illegal immigrants, but for whom the UK doesn't actually issue many visas? In other words, to what extent can this make some difference? And there is an element of that, as particularly those around, not exclusively, but particularly around those who might arrive by small boat. But on the issue of the question of visa overstayers, there are some countries to whom the UK gives lots of their nationals visas, not least India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Nepal, India in particular, where because of the number of visas that are given, there are quite a lot who overstay their visa, even if the proportion is relatively small. And so you could decide to be quite restrictive around that. But the challenge with that is that up to now, at least, governments of various colours have taken the decision that it is rational to offer plenty of visas, say, to people from India. And of course, the UK and India have a close relationship. There was that trade deal that was done relatively recently. India values the visa access that it gets to the UK. So there are a whole range of approaches that could be taken, from increasing the costs of visas, in other words, limiting the potential demand, to, you know, an outright squeeze in the numbers. But then you're going to be doing that alongside managing the diplomatic relationship with the country that you're dealing with. And I think, as I say, it's one of these sort of, what they hope is this toolkit of measures. They're very conscious of the visibility of small boats, basically the pictures from the White Cliffs of most days or lots of days. But there's the other element that is less visible, but also a big contributor to numbers, which is visa overstayers.
And help me out with something else here, Chris, which just wasn't clear as I was watching the news and listening to news podcasts from rural France last week.
Mm-hmm.
What is the government's position on ID cards?
Yeah.
Is are they going to happen? Are they sort of noodling the idea around? What is it?
They are noodling. I like a noodle. Noodle's a good word, isn't it? They are noodling around with it. So interestingly, I went to do an interview with the Prime Minister in Glasgow last week and was invited to do it before the whole Angela Rayner thing was as news.
Because it was meant to be about this subject,
it was meant
wasn't
to be about this, yeah. And what he had to say about ID cards, which didn't get a vast amount of attention last week, we did report it online and on Radio 4 and elsewhere, but it didn't get as much attention as it otherwise would because of the Angela Rayner row. What he had to say about ID cards was really interesting because he really lent into the idea of him thinking that they could be a very useful tool in dealing with the pull factors of the UK, and in particular, if you like, the black economy. And I was told he would be up for saying something about it, but I thought he might be quite guarded and not say very much at all. And he actually really lent into it and made an argument that says, because you might recall in the midst of time, the previous Labour government, Tony Blair, had a crack at doing all of this and has long been an advocate of them, but it never happened and there was a massive row and then the coalition government squashed the idea. The government has, in the last couple of weeks, people have been sort of falling over themselves to say that they're giving them a look. So Pat McFadden, the now Work and Pension Secretary, when he was in his previous job, went out to the Baltic states to look at the idea. The Prime Minister's talked about them. Shabana Mahmood today was saying she's always been a fan of them. She was a fan of them the first time round and she's still a fan of them now. The crucial thing, though, Adam, I was talking to the Conservatives about this, and you know, politically, I think the government's drawn to it because some of its opponents aren't so keen, or in some places are divided. So, Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, last week was sounding quite sceptical about the idea. Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, is much warmer about one potential iteration of an ID card. And this is the crucial thing the government's not spelling out now. Would it be a card that proved your right to work? There's mechanisms around that already. Would it be a card, and when I say card, a digital equivalent of a card that proved your right to access public services, like the NHS? Or would it be something that we'd all have to carry? And clearly the difference between those things is huge in terms of the arguments that could come along as far as civil liberties are concerned and all the rest of it. And also, therefore, where the dividing lines are between different political parties and people within a political party who might have a different view from their colleagues. So we don't yet know precisely what they want to do. They say they are exploring it. But it seems to me, given what the Prime Minister said to me the other day and what we've heard from the Home Secretary today, who would have not freelanced with their own personal view if it didn't tessellate with that of the government that she's just taken a very senior job in, they're coming. This is an idea the government is going to run with, and I think will be willing to pick a political fight over, knowing that some of their opponents will have a very different view.
Although we need to be realistic here, like the time frame for introducing something as vast as that in a country as big as this is like, we're talking decades potentially.
It's long, and there's all sorts of secondary questions as well, aren't there? Even for those who might be in principle in favour, which is how do you build, the database, the IT, the security of information. Governments don't have a wonderful track record for necessarily, and indeed sometimes with private enterprise as well. Looking after personal data, etc., etc. So there's massive kind of question marks around how you go about doing it, the timescale, the sort of magnitude of the idea. But it does seem like politically they are pretty keen on it as another example, as they would see it, of a tool in the toolbox that they're willing to use.
And we got details today of the timescale for the election of a new deputy leader of the Labour Party.
Yeah, so little quirk here. So you might think, well, hang on a minute, the reshuffle happened on Friday. Angela Rayner resigned from 3 jobs. So she resigned as Deputy Prime Minister, she resigned as Housing Secretary, she also resigned as the directly elected Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, elected by the Labour Party itself. And so there is a vacancy. And today what we found out, the party's National Executive Committee has met and it's agreed the kind of rules and timetable. And it's quick. It's quick. We'll find out who the new Deputy Leader is at the end of next month. I think it's Saturday the 25th of October. And by the end of this week, we'll know who the candidates are, or at least have a reasonable sense of them, because they'll have to have met the threshold of finding 80 of their colleagues, MPs, to have backed them. And then there's also thresholds around local support and all the rest of it. So the bar's pretty high. Some are already grumbling that it's being rushed. the flip side to that is that I speak to folk in and around government, and indeed Labour backbenchers who want the government to succeed, who just think the whole thing is the potential for a total nightmare, because the very nature of a conversation about wanting to be deputy leader is that it's ultimately going to be a political argument about whether Labour is any good in government, being conducted by people on their own side.
Although, is there a possibility that this contest never even really gets going? Because if if you need to get 80 members of the parliamentary party voting for you, and that happens next week, if only one person gets through that, then that's it done, isn't it?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, possibly.
Although now that I say that out loud, that sounds quite unlikely.
Yeah, I mean,
because the Labour Parliamentary Party is so huge,
exactly.
You would have to just have a total landslide victory within your fellow MPs.
Even if you got a runaway candidate amongst the MPs who maybe got, and I'm making these numbers up, obviously, 160. In other words, way more than they need. Given the scale of the parliamentary party, there are still hundreds of votes to grapple for. So it seems likely that there'll be a handful of candidates, but no more than that. 3 or 4. I mean, the maths doesn't work to have many more than that. And it's all going to happen super quick. So there'll be hustings this week. We'll soon have a sense of who the cliche alert runners and riders are. And then it's a case of, who does the government want? Is there anyone who is in government who wants to stand? Because they might fear that would be a pretty brutal experience, because they'd have to toe the line of government policy. And inevitably, the conversation is going to be about whether the government policy on X, Y, and Z is any good. And then from the government's perspective, can they find someone who is sort of broadly loyal to the government project, but can be a critical, constructive friend, rather than someone who perhaps is, as they might see it, a bit less constructive, or, to put it another way, a bit more kind of outspoken, a bit gobbier, really. And then there's as ever with these things, there's a sort of balance of outlook and geography and all the rest of it. Speaking to one person in government, I think that their dream candidate would be somebody who was from the north of England, was a woman, and was willing to be constructively critical. And then, interestingly, I was talking to Wes Streeting, the health secretary, on behalf of all the broadcasters in one of these pool clips, and I said, would you imagine this person would be in government in the way that Angela Rayner was? And his answer, effectively, I haven't got the exact words in front of me, but was effectively, they wouldn't have to be. So, there is a deputy prime minister, of course, David Lammy now. Doesn't have to be the same person as the deputy leader. But yeah, it's one of those sort of quirks of Labour Party democracy, which plenty of people within the party are very proud of. But when in government, comes with a inevitable awkwardness, potentially, particularly if it gets very, very noisy.
Well, I've been noodling around. Do you actually say noodling around, or is it just plain old noodling? Anyway, I have been discussing all of these issues and more with one of the newly appointed members of the cabinet. It is the Secretary of State for Scotland, Douglas Alexander, who actually is not a newcomer to that job, because he did it way back in the noughties. So this is his second go at being Scotland Secretary, and his first go at being on newscast, I think maybe